This episode of the RealAg Radio podcast is brought to you by AIM EC Herbicide from FMC. AIM EC Herbicide powers up your spring burn-off with control of the tough weeds like kochia and cleavers. And because it's a Group 14 product, AIM EC Herbicide is the cornerstone of a solid resistance management program.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147 at Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday midweek edition of the show. Hey, thanks so much, everybody, for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your work day. Really, really do appreciate you joining us. And everybody out there also listening on the RealAg Radio podcast, hello to you as well. Okay, today on the show, interesting. We're going to talk about the markets with John Driedger of Leftfield Commodity Research based out of Winnipeg. We're going to focus on the Western Canadian prairies. Of course, we do have this big USDA report on Friday, so that's going to create a whole bunch of discussion about corn and beans and how that reflects on the rest of the commodity complex. But today we're going to talk about wheat and canola and how dryness potentially impacts that acre mix. John's got some forecasts on acre movements on the prairies. We'll see if he sees any big changes coming for the 24 crop. Also, I also want to dive into pulses. So there is a bit of an expectation here that pulse acres are going up. Of the pulse crops, which ones will, or at least are being predicted to be up from an acreage standpoint, and just how all that fits into farm profitability, I think is the best way to put that. We're also going to hear a portion of the conversation I had yesterday with Carl Potts. He's the executive director with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. Well, we're talking about pulses in the markets. We might as well talk about some political stuff too. Now, Saskatchewan Pulse Growers has a breeding arrangement with Lima Grain. They're also working on one with the CDC again. Yesterday at their AGM, and I attended virtually, there was a pretty good, the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers AGM never disappoints. They always have some pretty good debate. Sometimes it's like, is there any resolutions? Nobody says anything. Are there any feedback? Nobody, not at the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers meeting. People go there to give their opinion. Well, I talked to Carl Potts, executive director, and we chatted about the future of plant breeding when it comes to pulses in the province of Saskatchewan and how that breeding should be funded, because there was a lot of debate whether or not SPG should even have this relationship with Lima Grain. Okay. And then another portion is should there be royalties and where do levy dollars go? And is there double dipping and, basically the farmer paying twice? It was a really, really interesting debate. And so we'll hear Carl's perspective from the organization standpoint on that here today. We'll also have some time for the top ag news stories of the day. If you have any feedback on today's program, well, you can get a hold of me by emailing me, shaney@realagriculture.com. Your feedback is always welcomed around here. I'm talking, but I want to hear your perspectives too. And another way to give your perspective is call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Got an email here from Doug, who's in Colorado. And Doug heard us talking about the issue on Monday. It was in the news about downtown or urban commercial real estate vacancies in the U.S. And this is also an issue in Canada. And I gave the example of Calgary. And Doug shared with me a really interesting link from the Globe and Mail about how Calgary is transforming old offices to apartments. And experts say other cities should follow. So taking some of those big high-rise buildings in the downtown that were meant for office space, those big head offices, and workers are now working in a hybrid environment. They don't even need to go to the downtown. In some cases, from a Calgary perspective, some of those head offices relocated to Houston in the oil patch and things like that. So it'd be really, really fascinating to see if this is this is something that really happens and there is a bit of a conversion. It's kind of interesting. Do I really want to live in the downtown? Like, yeah, I do in a certain stage of my life. I would definitely live in a downtown city. But, if I'm raising a family, do I want to? Maybe you do. And people do, right? But yeah, the article says no community anywhere would willingly choose to have a nearly 30% office vacancy rate in its downtown core. But one faced with that problem, one Canadian city came up with a plan that is now being held up as the model for the rest of the country amid an ongoing national housing crisis. I had heard one time that Calgary has the footprint, the downtown, for a city of 4 million people. I think we're 1.5 million, nor even remotely close to 4 million. So it's a very large downtown. So yeah, thanks for sharing that article, Doug. Really do appreciate it. Let's take a break. And when we come back, John Driedger, Leftfield Commodity Research, is here to talk about the markets. And we'll be right back right after this.
It's time for today's product spotlight. Joining me now on the line is Barry Mann. He's with Genesis Fertilizers. So tell me, Barry, what is the Genesis Fertilizer project?
It's a limited partnership with primarily farmer involvement, farmer ownership. And the project was formed to build out a Western Canadian fertilizer manufacturing and distribution system. So we're moving directly into the production of primarily urea, and then building out a system of distribution centers across Western Canada for the storage and blending. So farmers are taking a stake directly in the plant based on the amount of fertilizer they use on their farm. They're going to own the equities in the company that represent those tons that they're using. The ownership is going to be the farmers. Those profits, those margins, which are, like I said, are some of the greatest in the industry, they're going to stay on the farm.
For farmers who are interested, where could they go for more information?
GenesisFertilizers.com.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. Check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. Listen, are you seeking professional advice for your farm and business? Well, let me tell you, MMP's team of agriculture specialists cover it all. From business planning and tax guidance to financial projections, farm succession, and risk management, visit mmp.ca to connect with the experts today. Well, it's time to talk markets. And our guest today is John Driedger. He's a commodity analyst with Leftfield Commodity Research based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And he's got a big smile on his face because the Jets are doing amazing. So
the Jets are doing amazing.
If only the market could do as well as the Jets, John.
Yeah, and the Jets are overcoming some adversity, some injuries, terrible special teams, and they're still winning. And it feels like it's just kind of, it feels like the markets are acting a little more like maybe the Ottawa Senators or Columbus or something like that, unfortunately. So underperforming expectations.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, here, I guess where I want to start today is talking about some of the acre expectations for 2024 on the Western Canadian prairies. We know that the dry bias continues to overlay the market conditions in Western Canada on the prairies. We finally feel like we've got some winter. And when I say finally, it's sort of like, hey, now it feels a little bit more normal as we see some of the temperatures. Will it bring huge amounts of snow? We're going to need a lot more than what people have gotten so far for the most part. As you look at kind of the breakdown of all the different crops for the 24 season, acre thoughts, are there some surprises in store for us given what the market's doing right now and what some of the conditions are?
Yeah, I don't know if, at least in terms of our early expectations, Shaun, I mean, I'm not sure if surprises is necessarily the right word, and I'll maybe back it up half a step. And, I think one of the things as we think about acres, and it's maybe even more, well, I would say for farmers in general is, like they tend to not swing as much as, let's call it maybe market sentiment or prices or those sorts of things would dictate that they might. And I think that's just, for agronomic reasons. I think there's other factors that all go into why a farmer puts something in the ground, and prices is just, one of them, and it's an important one, but it is just one. And so, as we kind of do our analysis and our work on this, there tends to be sometimes smaller swings than one might think when you look at, the price of this is going down or that's going up or that sort of thing. There's just simply limitations that cap those a little bit. But as we did some work, and so we did some work on it. Let's call it mid-December. And so, some of the trends I would say is maybe not all that surprising in terms of, I think we're going to see canola down a little bit, maybe 3% 4%, maybe give or take. So we were just over 22 million last year. We think we'll be about 21 and a half. Spring wheat, maybe down a shade, but that's from a very, very high number. Durham is going to maybe be up a little bit and probably big acres, but, pulse is up a little bit. And so as you sort of go down, I guess, kind of as we go down some of the crops, as we weed through it, I would say not necessarily surprising in the context of, just, the price activity that we've seen and so forth, maybe more what you might kind of expect. And then the other part, and you mentioned about, some of the dryness here in Western Canada, that kind of layers in that is that some of the markets that are performing relatively well, and let's just say pulses in Durham, for example, are in those areas that or crops that are typically grown in some of those driest areas that have persistently had some drought. And so you look at something like canola that maybe bleeds some acres, it's probably going to be more so in those areas because, A, those crops are doing well, and B, it's those crops tend to do a little better, maybe relatively speaking, when it's drier. So you line some of those things up, and that's at least some of the very early leanings we have at this stage of the game anyways. So
interesting. So I just had a thought, John, as we're talking about this, and I think you're right. We when we talk about the acre breakdown in Western Canada, sometimes we tend to put it in the same context as, say, the U.S. corn soybean acre discussion, which can very much provide some surprises to the market. Last year's a really good example of what can happen on certain acreage reports. Are the acres a little bit more inelastic than some of the other markets in from a Western Canadian perspective? Like, are there less changes no matter which direction the market kind of goes? Like I'm not concluding that. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's maybe a little unique about Western Canada is I think we just have a more diverse, well, I don't know, maybe it's not fair to say more diverse crop mix. It's a little bit like saying the entire U.S. is like Iowa, which obviously it's not. But when we think about Western Canada specifically, I mean, so canola is the biggest crop, spring wheat, of course, but there's a lot of farms that grow, 3 or 4 crops on their farms. And so it is a diverse crop mix in Western Canada. And so in some sense, and again, you think in the US, corn, wheat, beans, and again, that's a bit, stereotypical and oversimplified and so forth. But I think because we do have this diverse crop mix and some of these areas are just so very, very different, so a sizable chunk of Western Canadian growing area is, say, for example, southern Saskatchewan and southern Alberta that tends to be drier. I mean, what happens there looks, an awful lot different than, say, in the Peace region of Alberta, which is a hugely important growing region, or northeast Saskatchewan or that sort of thing. So I think in some ways, I think if you look at Western Canada, I mean, you really do have to. It's not generic, it's pretty diverse. And some of those areas have very diverse crop mixes, and so I think in that sense, and again, maybe we live in our own, backyarditis a little bit when we think about primarily on Western Canadian crop markets, but it certainly seems like it is a diverse crop mix. There's a reason we cover, 14 or 15 different crops here as part of our weekly work. And some of them are relatively small, but they're really important maybe in that region. So it's, I'd say that's where maybe it is a little different in some ways.
And it would make sense that if the dry bias continues between now and, say, April 1st, canola would be the one that would probably have the biggest potential to be more to the downside. Like, the drier it is, the more likely somebody is probably to plant durum or even to plant spring wheat, no matter what those market conditions are. Or I don't think people would jump to chem fallow. And in some areas it's dry, but it's not like that dry. There some areas notwithstanding. But canola would be the one maybe that we would see more potential to go lower?
Yeah, I think possibly. So, for example, we came up with about 21.5 million acres in mid-December. And of course, the canola market has lost quite a bit of value since then. And again, we're reluctant to just flop around with every little ebb and flow in the market. Oh, guys are planting all this or not planting any of this. But I think the sentiment, I guess I would say, is that canola is vulnerable to maybe bleeding some acres around the margins. I mean, a lot of these decisions are probably already more or less etched in stone on a lot of farms. But kind of to speak to your point, Shaun, like if it's dry, canola is not a cheap crop to grow. It's relatively expensive. If prices have been coming down, I think there's just a real negative sentiment around the crop right now. One could argue that's too pessimistic, but either way, certainly values have been bleeding lower. And, so, okay, it's a little expensive, a little negative sentiment. Maybe you got a little more unpriced in the bin than you feel good about today. Now you have a little bit of extra, let's say, risk on the production side. It's a little dry, might that draw in a few more acres of, call it durum or, maybe barley or peas or something like that. I think that's plausible, so as we get towards spring, let's just say if the conditions are similar-ish to what we're looking at today, trending in that direction, I wouldn't be surprised if we look back and said our canola number is a little high where it is today. Now that's where we sit today. Of course, we got a few months where things can change. But I think, yeah, to speak to your point, Shaun, I think that's a crop that is vulnerable to maybe losing a little area between now and spring.
Well, to give you an idea on the bleeding, for example, I'm pulling up some data from Bar Chart, and if you look at the November 24 contract, okay, so this is 24 new crop, the average price in the last 5 years on the November contract is $712. Okay, we're sitting at 633. So we're below the 5-year average. Now, hey, listen, like we were, it sort of tells you where we were compared to where we are today, maybe a little bit. But yeah, we've I think bleeding is probably a good way to put it.
Yeah, and I mean there is an element of that for all crops as well, right? And these things are all relative. You look, for example, where say Minneapolis futures would be on based on a 5-year average or some others. I mean everything is sort of now drifting below maybe into that next range of prices. But having said all that, it's true. It's canola prices. They're historically high if you want to look, say, pre-2020. But certainly they're trading at the lowest level in several years. And might that stabilize and turn higher? Again, one might make a case that that's possible. But at the end of the day, it's a market that's soft, not the cheapest crop to grow from a risk reward perspective. Again, whether that is a right or wrong way to look at it from a farmer's perspective, every business is different. But it's not hard to kind of follow that train of logic and say, yeah, maybe around the margins, maybe some of that canola doesn't get in. And again, I don't think it'll be a huge collapse. I mean, it's a staple. It's a crop that's done well for farmers for a really long time. I don't think we've been anticipating just a collapse of canola acres or anything like that. I think that's far too dramatic.
Okay,
but from a production,
and some people are going to say, okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as you extrapolate that, Shaun, you maybe bleed a few acres and it's a little dry, and maybe yield is a little disappointing again. It's not hard to then see a couple dominoes fall where actually that crop gets quite short next year. And again, that's a couple ifs that are built into that.
Yeah.
But you can see where potentially, by the time next harvest rolls around, it's like, geez, that's a bit of a small crop. We lost some acres, yields are a bit soft. Who knows? But that's possible, right?
John just inserts the contrarian play right there. I like it. That's good stuff.
Yeah, don't construe that to a raging bullish outlook. It's just a range of possibilities, right? It's possibilities.
Honestly, man, this is exactly what the grower's going through right now in terms of, because I think there is a certain percentage where there is some flex acres. It may not be half the rotation. It isn't probably half the rotation, but there is some flex there. And leading up to the spring, how people look at what happens, from the moisture standpoint and which way they think the market's going to be going. It's gonna be a factor. What's interesting, if you look at soybeans in November, they've kind of rolled over the same way that canola has. So it's not just a canola issue. It's kind of an overall veg oil complex thing that's happening right now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Shaun. And as we think specifically, say, about canola, and you sort of build this case, maybe that crop possibly ends up a little short next fall. I mean, that's only one piece of the story. And to kind of speak to your point about soybeans, which is obviously enormously important for canola values, so I think smaller Brazilian crop probably largely baked into the market, although I guess we'll see. Chinese demand, is that a little bit vulnerable? One might argue that, although you never know exactly what's going to happen in China. That's always a bit of a mystery. If U.S. acres are a little bit higher next year, and again, maybe it's dry in the U.S. as well, for all we know. But it's not hard to see where maybe canola still looks relatively tight for say 24, 25, and yet dynamics around it, just kind of keep a lid on that price because maybe the external factors are a little bearish, and even just demand in general. I mean, commodity markets in general, something like crude oil is kind of it's a pretty soft market despite a tremendous amount of unrest in this critical area in the Middle East. You'd think at least there'd be some risk premium or something built in, and everything on paper, crude oil should be tight, and yet it's just trading soft. Maybe there's some broader economic issues that are spilling into commodity markets that grains aren't immune to. So I think all these dynamics, work into probably why we're just a little soft in grain markets in general, which is kind of getting beyond the specifics of acres for new crop per se. But you think about the things that are probably rolling around in growers' minds as they maybe wrestle with some of those flex acres, whatever portion of that farm there is.
Yeah, when you look at soybeans on the November contract, for example, we clear in the last year, the market clearly feels that 13 is kind of a lid on the market. And we're trying to establish whether, where we are today at 12 is kind of where we're comfortable from a bottom standpoint as we try to, we're kind of in this sideways sort of channel. But we got to remember as well that, in the last year, we have been down as low as like 11.25 or 11.30. So that's another 70 cents from where we are today. So we're kind of testing that sideways channel right now.
Yeah, and certainly, and of course, Friday's report is a big wild card with USDA. I mean, it is one of the more significant reports in the year, and sets the tone for maybe the next several weeks or month or more of trading, potentially, depending how the numbers come out. I mean, sometimes they come out as everyone expects, and it's a big nothing. But if we get a bit of a negative, some negative numbers, the way momentum is trending, I mean, it wouldn't, would it be shocking for us to break through support and test the lower end of that bounds? It all just feels a little soft right now. There's a lot of negative sentiment, and again, things I always feel the most negative at the bottom, and so want to be a little cautious about sort of just hopping on that bandwagon per se. But certainly the overall tone is soft. This market is looking for a trigger to try and kind of find some stability and turn higher, and there's just not a whole lot there to sink your teeth into.
We're going to have more of my discussion with John Driedger from Leftfield Commodity Research, but first, nitrogen fertilizer is your farm's #1 expense. Farmers are working together through Genesis Fertilizers to solve the problem of high prices and security of supply by planning a state-of-the-art nitrogen plant. Farmer-owned. Security and earnings through ownership is the solution. Visit Genesis today at genesisfertilizers.com to learn more. We'll be right back with more on RealAg Radio. We're going to be talking about the pulse markets with John when we come back. You're listening to RealAg Radio.
I'm Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomist, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
As you look ahead to the next growing season, there's a lot to consider when it comes to your crop. You need every possible advantage available to you. The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com has everything you need to make the best choice for you and your farm. On-demand videos with leading industry experts, available anywhere, anytime. Go into the season confident and ready with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com.
FP Genetics relentlessly brings innovative new seed genetics to Canadian farms, ensuring growers, breeders, and farmers are supported and viable. Being a valued partner on your farm for decades, you can expect the continuous pursuit of the best genetics. Visit fpgenetics.ca to discover FP's strong portfolio of wheat, durum, barley, oats, peas, and rye, or contact your local FP seed dealer or territory manager to discuss your certified seed strategy specific to your region.
Nutrient efficiency is rooted in your soil. Harness those nutrients with fertility services from Farmer's Edge, giving you access to our cutting-edge soil testing laboratory, for highly accurate and timely analysis of your fields. Find out more by going to farmersedge.ca/laboratory. We're going to continue our conversation with John Driedger. He is commodity analyst with Leftfield Commodity Research. Pulses have an opportunity to be up compared to the 23 crop. Give us the why of that, and which of the pulse crops is kind of leading that I guess that increase that you're speculating.
Yeah, so certainly we've and as you drill down to some of the individual pulses and then even the types within pulses, of course it's a diverse group. We think about pulses in general, but it is diverse. But for example, something like yellow peas, India opening up for some imports. I mean, that caused a pop in prices. Green pea prices are astronomically high. So we're going to see a bump in pea acres. Now, I don't know that we're going to see it, like from a historical perspective. I think pea acres actually won't be that high. We're looking for a bump of, maybe call it about 10% from last year. Percentage wise, that's a decent increase. And maybe it increases a little more just based on some price momentum. But that's still a bit below the 5-year average and well below some of the historical highs we've seen. I think, again, it might be one of those where dryness and maybe now a market that is maybe having some positive momentum compared to, say, canola and some of the cereals that are softer, maybe that number ends up increasing a little bit. But, green peas, again, sky high prices, that's going to end up sort of leading a little bit in terms of those pea acres increasing. Lentil acres will be up there too. Green lentil prices just astronomically high. And so that is going to drag some additional acres in. So, we think lentils will be up about 5% and again, that might be a bit on the low side, probably led by green lentils, just because those prices have just been phenomenal for old crops. So we sort of talk about this negative sentiment of these crop markets, and for most that is true, but certainly some of the pulses have had a bit of a better story here recently. And to the extent that impacts sentiment, and again, we talked about some of the dry conditions and just how those line up. Again, if we think about canola possibly, being a little on the high side based on what we thought, say, 3-4 weeks ago, well, maybe pulses have the potential to grab a little more ground here. Again, where we look at today, and things might change between now and when those final decisions get made. But
are green lentils and green peas the most profitable crops in your calculations?
Yeah, well, and on an old crop basis, they're extremely high. Now, of course, old crop values and new crop prices. I mean, there's that inverse, right? Which is normal for most crops at this time of year. So you're not going to, for example, see 70-cent new crop prices for large greens, even though old crop values are in that range. But certainly, even at new crop values, in terms of what's out there, they certainly rank really, really, really high relative to most other crops in those regions where they're grown. It might be even, for example, something seed availability and some of those things might put a little bit of a cap on acres. Now,
I was just going to say, what is the cap? Because I was thinking like a root rot, right? Like some people are going to be like, oh yeah, sure, profitable, but I've got issues with root rot. I just can't grow peas or lentils on those acres as much as I would love to. That would feel to me like that's kind of the cap: seed availability and root rot.
Yeah. Oh, and you're 100% right, Shaun. And that's where kind of even at the beginning of our conversation, we talked a little bit about, you sort of, everyone's going to grow this or no one's going to grow that or whatever. I mean, honestly, from our perspective, that sentiment ends up swinging far wider. The sentiment pendulum swings much wider than what the actual on the ground plantings turn out to be, for exactly that kind of reason, as you mentioned on the pulses. Yeah. On paper, the acreage increase probably should be much, much higher. It won't be for exactly as you mentioned, whether it's disease issues, rotation, seed availability. There's just these things that just end up just naturally putting a cap on acres for some of these crops that, again, on paper should be, much higher, and they're not for those reasons.
Well, John, hey, I really appreciate it. We're looking forward to that USDA report on Friday. It's going to give us lots of fodder to chat about on Friday and over the weekend into next week. Really appreciate you joining us here and talking about the acres for 2024 on the Western Canadian prairies. And we will see how it all turns out. And Mother Nature's probably going to have a little bit of say on changes between now and seeding time. John, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it, Shaun. Thank you.
Didn't even get a Go Jets go in there. That's great. Hey, we'll talk to you later.
I'm slipping. Yeah, thanks, Shaun.
When we come back on RealAg Radio, we're going to hear from Carl Potts. He's executive director with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. Find out what happened at their AGM. There was a big discussion all about how plant breeding should be funded on pulses in that province, and we're going to hear all about that when we come back. You're listening to RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147.
Through a growing storm of kochia, cleavers, chickweed, and more, there's a clear path. Introducing Oxbow, a versatile cereal broadleaf herbicide that gets the job done. Powered by Duplisan technology, Oxbow is your workhorse on resistant kochia and other tough weeds. With flexibility in timing, rates, and recropping options, your path is clear. Find your way on the path of least resistance at newfarm.ca/Oxbow.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Are you ready to revolutionize your farming practices and stay ahead in the ever-evolving world of agriculture? You're listening to this show, of course you are. But also, you can join the Crossroads Crop Conference January 29th through the 31st at the Westin in Calgary. That's at the airport location. There's a beautiful Westin Airport Calgary hotel. It's got honestly, a great breakfast and a bar. Fantastic. You can register at crossroadscropconference.ca and get ready to examine big picture innovation in agriculture. We're now going to dive into a discussion that I had with Carl Potts. This interview was recorded on Tuesday of this week, yesterday. And Carl and I talked about a bunch of things. You can hear the full interview by going to our YouTube channel. And we also have it posted at realagriculture.com. I want to post a portion of I want to play a portion of the interview with you. It's about 10 minutes where we talk about plant breeding and levies collected from farmers, and that funding plant breeding and where that money goes, how some money comes back to the organization, and how royalty structures, SVUAs, fit into this whole discussion. Because it was a very heated debate back and forth amongst the growers on a resolution. Now, in the interview, I didn't read out the resolution, so I thought I would do that for you now, at least the ending part. So it's all about VUAs, but it says, therefore, be it resolved that pulse varieties fully funded or partially by levy payers will not have variety use agreements attached. That's the basis of the discussion. Of course, SPG does have a breeding partnership with Lima Grain. There was indicated at the meeting, and I'll talk about this in the interview, with the CDC, or this one with the CDC is pending. They're working on it, and Carl does say there are some others that are potentially coming. So let's listen to the conversation I had with Carl Potts about this. Now, plant breeding, this is always a highly discussed topic at SPG meetings. How close are you? You mentioned in the meeting today that you have an agreement with Lima Grain that's been in place for 3 years. I think about. You're working on another agreement with the CDC at the University of Saskatchewan. How close are you to having that deal put together?
Yeah, I think we're very close. We're expecting in the next half year or so that we will have a new agreement in place with the CDC, and we're really excited about that. We've had a long history of working collaboratively with the Crop Development Center at the university. We have taken some time, both CDC and SPG, to sort of chart the course, in a new direction for the future, and we're really excited about that. But it's a big change and a big transition, and it's important that we talk about that at annual general meetings like today. And we did have a very thorough and rigorous discussion about that. But so SPG for the future will be making new investments with a multitude of breeding partners. Lima Grain was one of our first ones, but we will be also making partnerships and new investments with public breeding companies as well. We think it's both public and private. breeders and researchers that are needed in order to tackle the challenges and opportunities, not only for today, but for the future in pulses.
By listening to the discussion today, as yourself and the chairman were talking about this subject, it doesn't sound like the new CDC agreement will be like the old one in the sense of it won't be royalty free.
Yeah, that's true. It was very clear from the CDC when our previous agreement was ending that they were interested in a new model and a new partnership where they would have multiple sources of funding, but they also would generate some of the revenue for their program through royalties. So that's why we've been talking at AGMs and winter meetings and other things for the last 2 or 3 years about how that model is changing. That royalties are coming, but we're excited about the opportunity that that's going to present to bring new varieties, faster genetic gain by creating an environment where multiple breeders and multiple scientists can all be working on pulses. So we're excited about our agreement with Lima Grain. We're excited about our new potential agreement with Crop Development Center, and I think there'll be more to come.
There is other players out there that are attractive.
Yeah, pulses though are a small crop globally, a small set of crops globally. So there aren't a huge number of companies that are banging down the door to make breeding investments for crops that are just a few million acres in Canada. They're a big crop in Canada, but globally we're still very small relative to all the big the big crops. But even canola and other crops that we grow in Canada are much larger in Canada and globally than pulses are. So it's about picking the right partners, long-term partners, both public and private, that we think can all work collaboratively to achieve new potential for farmers.
Well, you alluded to the resolution, the debate. There was a pretty good back and forth from some of the delegates about a resolution. The resolution, I don't need to read it verbatim, but essentially was the resolution was about SPG not supporting breeding programs that were going to be doing SVUAs in the future. The resolution was voted down by the delegates. I guess, what can you tell our audience about why the SVUA model is something that the board has chosen to pursue with Lima Grain in that agreement, and is also talking to CDC about it?
Yeah, and I want to make it clear. I think we see the vision and the opportunity for this model, not only for a Lima Grain agreement, but for other ones as well. A couple of things. It's becoming increasingly expensive to solely fund pulse breeding programs or breeding programs with grower dollars only. We saw that in the escalation of costs over time with our previous agreement. So we expect to be a partial funder alongside other collaborators in multiple breeding agreements. But in order to create that investment environment where new and additional investment, both public and private, come to the pulse sector, we need to have an opportunity for those organizations to generate some revenue from those new varieties. We think that that's good for farmers too, because it'll be then those organizations that are generating the varieties that farmers are growing, which will be the ones that will be receiving royalties. So farmers can effectively vote with their choices on varieties. The other thing that's important to stress there is that we feel farmers will always have choice. We've committed to keeping existing royalty-free varieties available to farmers. So any new agreements and new varieties that come out with VUAs or other sorts of royalties associated with it have to be worth the money that's being charged. So there'll be competition in the system, and we think that farmers will benefit from that.
So yeah, this decommissioning or removing old varieties was a big, several farmers brought this up in the meeting. Based on what I heard, this Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, you have control of those old royalty-free varieties. You just said you're not intending to remove those from the market.
Absolutely. Those varieties were funded by grower investment. We have we have royalty-free access to those varieties. They're already commercialized. They're out there growing. Farmers can continue to grow those, with no seed royalties, no farm-safe seed royalties as far as they go. And we think that that's a very important competitive check. So, it's a high hurdle then for any new companies coming to the market to be able to bring forward varieties. But, our board discussed this a lot and said, well, we don't want to be just paying high costs for Me Too varieties. So, with those existing varieties out there and being continuously available, the new varieties just, need to be better before they're going to get much market share.
I think, I would imagine that, and I've actually toured the Lima Grain facility in Saskatoon myself. I've seen it with my own eyes. A variety comes out, this was brought up as well, but a variety comes out that solves the root rot issue, at least in some regard. I wonder what the discussion is after that, because that would be bringing, there's yield, and then there's like solving a major problem and a huge threat to the pulse acre in the province of Saskatchewan and beyond its borders. That really right now I think is the holy grail for breeders to solve that problem. Boy, that's a pathway to all of a sudden, I think maybe some of the opinions changing about this. Maybe, I don't know. That's my thought.
Well, we spent a lot of time meeting with farmers and winter meetings and other places that we can engage with growers. And we know long-term pea and lentil growers that have said, I've needed to move away and move out of pulses because of Phantomyces and root disease related issues. So it's a big deal. And, and those growers and other growers have said to us, if there can be a variety that's resistant or partially resistant, like that's going to be a game changer. And they're willing to pay more. I think what we, hear in some of the debate here today is a fear about having to pay, higher seed costs. But there has to be this balance between, between value from a new variety and, and increased costs. And what growers have been telling us is that if there can be stepwise change in yields, like big bumps in yields, if there can be additional herbicide tolerances in lentils, if there can be a Phantomyces resistance or other disease resistance in pulses, they're willing to pay more for that because it brings more value to their operations.
Did the SVUA revenue, some of that obviously goes back to the breeder. Does some of that money come back to, is the intention for some of that money to come back to Saskatchewan Pulse Growers to compensate them for the original levy dollars that went into the variety development?
Exactly. As our board was debating, the new direction in pulse crop support and breeding, this notion of growers paying twice is something that we talked a lot about. And so that's why it's an important principle for any new investment that we're going to be making into pulse crop breeding. If we're going to invest grower dollars up front, that we need to be receiving a share of those royalties on the back end. And that's part of the way that we can deal with this legitimate question and concern about, growers paying twice. Now, It doesn't flow back, directly to those growers, but we can reinvest, those dollars into breeding, research and other, forms of research for the benefit of farmers. And maybe over time, longer, down the road when you and I maybe are doing other things, we'll be to a point where some of these breeding programs can be a little bit more self-sustainable, and we may not have to invest as much grower levy dollars upfront. But it was really clear to us that there's need for upfront investment right now, in order to make programs, sustainable, and we'll see where things go for the future.
That was Carl Potts, Executive Director with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. Would love your opinion on this whole topic, because I think the farmer's point of view is really important here. And I heard, as I watched the AGM, farmers on both sides of this. As I said, the motion was defeated, but there was a lot of debate, and very much a debate. You could categorize it this way. A lot of NFU members arguing for this resolution, and a lot of non-NFU members voting or arguing against the motion. And it's not that simple, but the NFU definitely had a presence there for sure. So, but what do you think? Real Agriculture audience out there on RealAg Radio, and you don't have to be from the province of Saskatchewan. This is, SVUAs are a big topic in general in Canada, and how are they a path to how plant breeding should be funded going forward? You can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or of course call the RealAg feedback line. That's the best way to get a hold of us. Like, call the RealAg feedback line. 855-776-6147. When we come back on RealAg Radio, we're going to get to the top ag news stories of the day right after this.
What's next for your fields? At Pioneer, delivering industry-leading genetics drives everything we do. From the scientists in the lab to our local teams with boots on the ground, we are determined to get there first. Developing top-performing products, proven in more growing conditions than ever before. Pioneer. What's next happens here. Visit pioneer.com/Canada to learn more.
Whether you're a rookie soybean grower or a seasoned vet, the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com has exactly what you need to stay in the game. The latest research and the best agronomic advice from industry experts, along with local and global market coverage on demand, anywhere, anytime. Make this growing season your best growing season with the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com.
Let's dig into the top ag news stories of the day. Like your own health, your crops need regular maintenance and frequent checkups to ensure optimal health. Farm Command from Farmer's Edge is your digital field assistant where you can track your applications and be notified of crop health changes. Visit farmersedge.ca/farmcommand to book a demo. Okay, top ag news stories of the day. It's interesting this time of the year what kind of the focus. We've rolled over and we're thinking about the year ahead for sure. The World Bank has warned about the global economy's poor prospects for 2024. At the outset, before I get to how the story is written here, concerning from a demand standpoint for sure. So according to the projections, the global economy is expected to expand by 2.4%, down from 2.6% in the previous year. This slowdown is attributed to higher borrowing costs and geopolitical tensions. The World Bank notes concern about the decade ahead if significant changes aren't made to address these challenges. Additionally, it mentions that global trade growth is expected to be only half of what was in the decade before the pandemic, and developing countries have experienced lower growth rates since 2020 due to these factors. So tied to all this, inflation expectations in the U.S. have improved significantly. According to a survey by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, American consumers now anticipate a 3% increase in prices for the current year. This marks the lowest level of year-ahead inflation expectations since January of 2021. Additionally, consumers foresee an annual inflation rate of 2.6% over the next 3 years, the lowest prediction since the mid-2020. This development is likely welcomed by Federal Reserve officials who believe that public expectations play a crucial role in influencing inflation. When households and businesses expect persistent high inflation, it is more likely to become a reality. And I remember when we first started talking about inflation and that being a concern, is there was all that COVID money that was pumped into the economy. The reality is that like the more we talk about it, the more it's like a foregone conclusion. Because what happens is pick a company has more of an excuse to raise the prices because people have an expectation that, hey, prices are going up. And so it enables them to be able to do it. So there's like the market moving it higher, but there's also human nature and people's perceptions and people's actions as well that does that. China food security, agricultural corruption crackdown is far-reaching, according to the South China Morning Post. They report that a corruption crackdown in the agricultural sector of a key northernmost province has far-reaching significance when it comes to ensuring China's food security, according to a 4-part documentary series by the state broadcaster CCTV. A total of 1,011 cases of corruption have been filed, and 1,367 officials in the province have been disciplined as of November, according to the second episode of the series produced by CCTV and China's anti-corruption agency, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which was the CCDI. Now, that aired on Sunday. What the story didn't say is actually what was that corruption? And how does that tie to food security? People on the take, bribes, not stealing, not really sure. But definitely a bit of a crackdown there, as the China Morning Post is reporting. Chinese online gaming tycoon ranks as a major U.S. landowner. This isn't going to sit well with some of the things that are being discussed in the U.S. in terms of limiting ownership by China when it comes to farmland in the U.S. The Chinese national, who amassed his wealth through online gaming, is now one of the most prominent non-American landowners in the U.S. Chen Taiku, I'm not saying that properly, but Chen owns a substantial 198,000 acres of timberland in Oregon, ranking him as the country's 82nd largest property owner according to the Land Report. Foreign ownership of U.S. land, especially land utilized for farming, has become a very politically sensitive topic in recent years, with approximately 40 million acres of American agricultural land owned by non-U.S. entities as of 2021. And the important component of the story is the fact that Canadians rank as the highest owners of U.S. farmland. Of all the non-U.S. landowners, Canadian citizens rank as the number one. Now, a lot of the political discussions in terms of who should the U.S. be limiting in terms of owning U.S. farmland, China comes up, Iran comes up, North Korea comes up, Russia comes up. Canada is not the target. But and some people in Congress have pointed out that Canada needs to be excluded from this. Now, the question is that is that reality? Does that happen? Or do some people feel that even Canadians should be prevented from owning some of that farmland? We'll see as some of those new policies and legislation get drafted and see if they make their way through Congress. This is a wake-up to Canada a little bit, or at least I wanted to make that point. Be on your toes, Canada, when it comes to developing trade markets. USDA allocates over $203 million to boost U.S. ag exports in 2024. USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service announced investments totaling $203 million in nearly 70 agricultural organizations for the expansion of export markets for the U.S. food and agricultural products in the fiscal year of 2024. This support is provided through market access programs, MAP, and Foreign Market Development, the FMD program. So, this is that's a big number, right? We're talking about $200 million being put into ag organizations to develop trade markets. So, we don't need to Canada doesn't need to put $200 million into that, but on a comparative basis, per commodity that we're talking about, you do need to do some of the relative comparisons and make sure that we are properly funding our Canada's ability to be competitive. Because I said this, I think it was last week. When you think about the beef market, the pork market, there is very integrated. The supply chain is very integrated between Canada and the U.S., and including Mexico in that too. That doesn't mean, though, that the two countries don't compete on a toe-to-toe, very competitive basis when we're talking about exports. So that's friends off when it comes to trade. Supreme Court upholds poultry companies' judgment sharing agreement in price-fixing litigation. The U.S. Supreme Court decided not to review a lower court ruling regarding an agreement among major poultry companies to share the cost of any judgments in price-fixing litigation cases. Also, Walmart's $350 million dairy plant in Georgia signals transformative shift in the industry. Walmart's intention to construct a $350 million dairy processing facility in Georgia has potential to bring a significant change in the dairy industry, particularly in the southeastern United States. Yeah, it's always evolving, always changing. Walmart you think about the meat and the dairy, definitely getting involved. So instead of relying solely on suppliers, the largest food retailer in the U.S. plans to buy milk directly from farmers. This shift in the approach could have transformative implications for the dairy sector, according to analysts. If you have any feedback on today's show, send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. And of course, thank you so much for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio, and we will chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for downloading this episode of the RealAg Radio podcast, brought to you by AIM EC Herbicide from FMC. Whether applied with glyphosate or another labeled tank mix partner, fast-acting AIM EC Herbicide is the go-to tank mix product for the hottest burn-off of the toughest weeds. Start out clean this spring with AIM EC Herbicide.